Hello, it's Dawn Michelle from Boho Tarot, and today I wanted to do a VR to Nina at Shuffle Tarot on my top 10 reading decks of 2021. I thought this was a really great tag because a lot of times, we share like our newest or our latest and greatest decks, but those aren't always the ones that you actually end up working with the most. And I can tell you that that was definitely the case for me. While I swap my decks around pretty consistently from week to week and definitely from month to month, there are some certain decks that I definitely use repeatedly throughout a year for various different readings or practices. So I thought this was a really great opportunity to share those decks that maybe necessarily weren't like the most latest and greatest, newest, most amazing deck in my collection, but were definitely the most used throughout the entire year. So let's go ahead and jump into my top 10 reading decks of 2021. So I have put these in a little bit of an order for you. The first 6 decks that I'm going to show you are decks that I basically used all the time, all throughout the year for general readings. So anytime I had just a basic general reading that I wanted to do, I had a tendency to pull one of these 6 decks kind of above anything else in my collection. So the first one that I want to share with you is the Gentle Tarot. Now, I guess this one is kind of a little bit of a cheat because I didn't start using it till May of this year, but I used it like all by itself all throughout May. It was the only deck that I used. And I also used it pretty regularly after that. I do have a little prototype of the pocket edition as well, and that has not left my altar space. This deck has not really left my table much, and I use it all the time. I love the artwork. There is just something so special, so charming about this artwork. And there's a lot of love and intention that I think really went into this deck. And I feel that with this deck. I think it's so appropriately named the Gentle Tarot. This is one of the most loving and supportive decks in my collection. However, it doesn't necessarily shy away from the harder things either. So I find that it's actually a really balanced reader for me. But I absolutely love working with it. I just have developed, I think, over working with it pretty intensively for an entire month and then continuing to work with it all throughout the rest of the year. I've just developed a really kind of tight bond with this deck, and I feel like it gets me. I feel like I get it. But again, this is just a deck that really hasn't left my table much. I use it all the time for readings. Like I said, I kind of alternate back and forth between this one and the prototype pocket deck. And I absolutely love it. Like, I don't even know what else I could say about this deck. I am gushing because this is a deck I love. And this is one of those tags where, like, I'm gonna probably gush over most of these decks because there is a reason that these decks are all my most used decks from the year. And a lot of these, I suspect, will continue to be most used decks probably into the next year as well. But the Gentle Tarot is definitely one of my favorite decks in my collection. I love working with it. It's absolutely stunning. It has beautiful backs, gorgeous matte cardstock, gorgeous matte gold gilding. I don't know what else to say about it. It's like basically one of my favorite decks now. I can't imagine this ever leaving my collection, and I'm so glad I have it. And I used it all the time. Throughout pretty much from May on, I used it probably weekly at least. So that for me is really saying something considering how often I actually swap my decks. So that is the Gentle Tarot. So another deck that I just have to gush about because it is amazing is the Future Ancestor Tarot. And you'll see with this one, I actually keep the little fold out in with my deck, which I don't do very often because the write-ups in here are fantastic, and I really enjoy working with them. So the Future Ancestor Tarot was a deck that I bought myself for my birthday. And once I kind of got into it in, I think maybe June, I have read with this deck quite a bit. It is, again, kind of like the Gentle Tarot. It's very loving. It's very nurturing. It has a tendency for me to kind of pull more toward the positive, but it does have a little bit of some kind of underlying shadow energy that it kind of just hints to. It kind of just gives you an idea that there might be something there that you need to kind of look into a little bit more. And I really appreciate that about it because it tells me what I need to know or tells me that maybe there's more that I need to dive into or need to explore, but it doesn't kind of slap me upside the face with it. So It's, again, another very gentle deck. I think that that's something that I've really been drawn to quite a bit in the last 2 years because, you know, life just the last 2 years has been rough. The world has been rough the last 2 years. I love what this deck does. I love the mixed media collage of it. The energy of it is just so fantastic. The limited color palette or the restrained color palette, this almost monochromatic, is just to die for. I love it. I'm kind of a sucker for decks with a really minimal color palette or a really restrained color palette. Just something about that just kind of makes the use of color where it's being used just feel really, really potent. Particularly in a deck like this where there's just very minimal pops of color on each of the cards, and those little pops of color, like I said, feel very potent. They feel like they actually reveal more than sometimes what's going on in the black and white artwork. But again, so here's a great example, this Eight of Needles. It doesn't shy away from the harder things, but you know, it kind of approaches it in a pretty gentle way. So this is definitely a deck that I think you could use for some serious healing as well. It definitely has a very wonderful healing, nurturing energy to it. And it's just, yeah, something I enjoy working with. I find myself working with this deck a lot. I did actually edge it in this beautiful gray to match the backs, kind of a heathery gray. I just have no complaints about this deck whatsoever. I love the cardstock. I love the size. I love the way it reads. No complaints. So again, that is another deck that I worked with a lot in the mid to, well, through now, part of 2021, and it's definitely one that's probably going to remain a favorite in my collection, I would imagine, for quite some time to come. So again, that's the Future Ancestor Tarot. So another deck that I read with quite a bit and have tended to read with ever since I've got it quite a bit is the Animals Divine Tarot. Now, I apologize, this is an out-of-print deck, but I do absolutely love this deck. I did mention this deck in the 7 Deadly Sins tag because it is the deck that I showed as kind of like my pride and joy. I love this deck. I'm so glad that I was able to get a hold of it. It reads so well for me, and it is like the animal deck that got me kind of interested and willing to work with an animal deck. But we also have the gods and goddesses in the quartz and the majors, which is fantastic. I love that kind of blending of the magical and the mundane that we get in this deck, and it reads so beautifully for me. I even have the app on my phone. So again, this is the Animals Divine Tarot, another deck that I worked with quite a bit in 2021. So a little surprise deck for me when I actually went back and looked at kind of the readings that I've done and the decks that I worked with. I was actually surprised to see how often I actually use this little deck. It is in one of Danny Mystic's little mini Pixie Rose bags, which is amazing. I love it. This is my little mini Centennial. So believe it or not, even though it is a Rider-Waite Smith, right? It is the Rider-Waite Smith. I have been using the heck out of this little deck. I've been using it for Celtic cross readings. So I have kind of like my own little version of that. I've done a video on it. If you want to check that out, I'll try to remember to link it for you. But I love working with this deck with that little Celtic cross reading. It reads so beautifully. And the other thing that I've noticed is that it tends to be a deck, because I think it actually lives in my bedroom, it tends to be a deck that I do a lot of evening time readings with. So I'll pull like 3 cards kind of at the end of the night to just kind of wrap things up. If I have a question, if something like pops into mind when I've kind of like gone to my room for the evening or like before I go to bed, if something pops into my mind, I will just grab this deck and do a reading on it real quick. If I'm just like, I don't know, watching Tarot Tube, I have this deck in hand and I'm playing with it. So it's a deck that I've been using quite a bit. I do have the full-size edition, and I've done several readings with that as well this year, but it's, you know, basically the same deck. This little mini version, though, I've used all the time, and I use it almost daily, either for larger readings or just, you know, to answer some questions, or just to pull some cards in the evening, or just to kind of hang out and play with it. while I'm, you know, hanging out watching TV or whatever. So it's pretty fun, and it kind of surprised me. And I guess it's mostly because it's such an easy reader, right? Because it's the RWS, so it's such an easy reader. I don't have to struggle with it at all, and it's handy because it's always there and it's little, and I can kind of use it pretty much anywhere. And it's in the cutest little bag in the world. So again, little mini tin version of the Centennial Waite Smith. So another deck that I found myself reaching for all the time, which isn't really a surprise because I love this deck, and this is the Dreaming Way Tarot. This is my like totally kind of wonky trim. I'm half tempted to repurchase this deck just to trim it up a little bit nicer, but I just haven't done it yet. I am tempted though, I will be honest. This is one of those decks, again, it's kind of another just RWS clone, so it's a really easy reader, but I love the energy of this deck. It just gives me such wonderful, clear readings. I don't struggle at all for messages or meanings, and so it tends to be one that I pull quite often when I just have like kind of general readings to do. The little tin version, this deck, and the next deck that we're going to look at are all three just really easy readers for me, and so I tend to gravitate towards them when I just need to do a reading and I don't like need a bunch of fuss, or I don't want to go searching for like the perfect deck, right? I just need one that I know is going to work well, that is going to read well for me. I just love this deck. I've had it for many years now, and it's a favorite in my collection like every year. Here's the weird backs. They're fine. I edged it in this weird green. It's a weird deck. You don't probably often see it in my tarot journal because it's not one I use for like my structured readings. This tends to be a deck that like I pull for when I have like in the moment readings, or I just need to do a reading for whatever reason. Maybe I'm not necessarily going to journal it, or maybe it's going to be a really deep reading and I'm going to do it in my personal journal rather than my normal tarot journal. But it's just, yeah, it's a wonderful deck. It works beautifully for me, and I love reading with it. So again, that is the Dreaming Way Tarot. So the last of my sort of general reader decks is the Morgan Greer. Now I do have this and the tin version, and even though I only pulled one out, I do use them both actually. The tin version kind of lives in my living room, and this version lives in my office. So depending on where I am, kind of depends on which one I end up pulling. I love them both. I think they both read pretty much the same for me. But this is one of those decks that is just, again, a really super easy reader. I love this deck. It has like total vintage vibes that remind me of my childhood. Like I love all the mustaches. Like it's a whole thing, right? It's a whole thing. And I love working with this deck just for general readings. It just reads beautifully for anything that I kind of throw at it. It's also been one that I've used on occasion for like readings to do with my family, my extended family. As I think I've mentioned, like my immediate family, I tend to use the Anna K, but for extended family, I tend to use this a lot, but I mostly use it for just general readings. Like I said, the little tin version lives in my living room. This version lives in my office. And so I use them both fairly equally. With the mini deck of this that lives in my living room, I tend to just pull it out and play with it when I'm in the living room. So I'm not even necessarily always doing readings with it. Sometimes I'm just playing with it. I'm just shuffling and pulling a card just to see what it has to say. But it's definitely a deck that I like to use and find to be really wonderful for just any sort of general reading. And it just works beautifully for that for me. And I love it. I love the vintagey vibes of it. It's very much a nostalgia deck for me. Even though like I didn't have this deck back then, but it reminds me of my childhood. And I don't know, there's just something super comforting and familiar about it that I really love. So again, that is the Morgan Greer Tarot. So moving into decks that I kind of use for specific things all throughout the year. Well, this one isn't really all throughout the year, so I guess I'm fibbing a little bit there because I really didn't get this till the end of summer, I want to say, of this year. But this is the Lioness Oracle Tarot, and this deck has kind of blown me away. You probably know if you saw my All That Mattered video, where I kind of a love letter to this deck. It wasn't like just about this deck, but this deck did kind of inspire it, so there is that. But anyway, this deck has been absolutely amazing. I have done so much personal growth work with this deck, and it has really kind of become a key part of that particular practice for me. And I so enjoy working with it. It really does something special. It totally surprised me. It could definitely be like if, there was a tag like decks that surprised me in 2021. This would be like at the top of my list because I wasn't really sure about it when I bought it. And I was kind of like, I don't know about this artwork. I don't know about this whole like hand collage thing, but I love it. It has so much wonderful energy. It is on the nurturing and the supportive side, but it also kind of kicks me when I need a little kick, like particularly when it has to do with like creative projects. That's been a huge portion of the work that I've done with this deck, is to kind of overcome some creative blocks and creative issues. I've also used it for a lot of personal growth, self-healing type of readings as well, and it's done beautifully for that. There doesn't seem to be much that I can't throw at this deck, so it definitely, I feel like, is one that I could use for just about anything, but it does feel very kind of attuned into creative challenges or dealing with creativity, as well as kind of like personal growth and healing as well. I think it does beautifully for that, and that tends to be kind of how I've been working with it. It's kind of become like my, I don't know what else to call it besides like my personal growth deck. This is just the deck that I am working through issues with and trying to, create some change and cultivate some growth in my life. And this deck has been really, really key in that, and it's been wonderful. So I've really enjoyed it. I do quite like the cardstock. It's a little big. It's like closer to Oracle size. So I do have a little bit of a hard time shuffling it. It has a beautiful matte gold gilding. The backs are beautiful with all the roses. Yeah, I really, really enjoy it. And it's been kind of the main deck that I've been using for my personal growth work. So again, that's the Lioness Oracle Tarot. Another deck that I've found myself using quite a bit all throughout this year, which just really isn't a surprise because I used it a ton last year too, and this is the Black Lily Tarot. This deck, here's the beautiful backs. This deck I call kind of my inner truth teller nudity alert. There might have been nudity in other decks and I didn't notice, but this deck is my no holds barred. It does not hold back. It does not sugarcoat anything. It tells me exactly what it is I need to hear, even if that's not what I want to hear. That's just too dang bad. This deck is going to give it to me like it is. It doesn't sugarcoat it. It just says, here's the truth about what's going on. I don't care if you want to hear it. Suck it up, Buttercup, and deal with it. And I love that about this deck. And so it's a deck that I use whenever I need a good butt kicking, and turns out that's actually quite often. When I just want like the super honest truth, I don't want any fluff. I don't want my hand held. I don't want to be nurtured. I don't want to be coddled. I just want you to tell me what it is that I need to know. This is the deck that does that for me. And it really kind of reveals sort of that inner truth, which is why I kind of call it my inner truth teller. And it just works beautifully for that. And I love it. I love it. It's fantastic. It is beautiful. I really love the artwork, but it's more about what this deck does, which is kick my butt when I need it to. So again, that is the Black Lily Tarot, which is the deck I use all the time when I need a little butt kicking, because we all need that from time to time, right? Okay, two more decks that I want to talk about, and that is my two main moon decks that I used. So I do a personal reading on the new and full moon every year, every month, not year, every month. And I have a variety of decks that I use for that practice or those practices, and they each have that kind of energy that I tap into during that time. The deck that I used the most for my new or dark moon readings is the Seasons of the Witch Samhain Oracle. This pairs really well with a lot of the decks that I work with in that particular time. And so part of it is because it pairs so well, but part of it is because the artwork and the keywords, I feel like the keywords are just really tuned into that kind of dark new moon energy that it just, I don't know, it just works really well for me. So I do use this one quite frequently for that. I mean, yeah, I used it around, you know, Samhain and everything as well too, but I've actually been using it pretty much every month since I got it. And I have been using it primarily in my moon readings. So it's been really wonderful and I've really enjoyed it. I apologize for the flash of the overhead lights, but it's super dark here and you wouldn't be able to see anything if I didn't have all the lights on. So we're rolling with it. We're rolling with it. Anyway, this has been a wonderful deck for my dark new moon readings. It's been fantastic and I love that it pairs so well with all of the decks that I used during that time. And it's just, yeah, was the one I used the most. So that's the one that I pulled out. Again, that's the Seasons of the Witch Samhain Oracle. So for my full moon readings, I had kind of a little bit of a, let's say almost like a three-way tie between this deck, the Moonchild Tarot, and the Starchild Tarot. Those three decks, or these three decks, and this is the Ember and Aura, which is obviously the one that I chose. This I have trimmed. I do have a mod with me on my channel with this deck. I use those three decks pretty consistently for my full moon readings. But this deck, when I actually went back and looked at my readings, this deck I used more often in 2021. So it was a close one. It really, really was. I seemed to kind of rotate them out almost like monthly. But there were a couple of months that I used this deck a couple of months in a row, and so that kind of nudged out the other two. But just honorable mention, I did use the Moonchild Tarot and the Starchild Tarot for my full moon readings quite frequently as well. I really do love this deck. I struggle a lot during the full moon. It's like a really overwhelming energy for me, and I have a really hard time being super functional and feeling decent during that time. I feel very drained. I tend to feel really emotional. And so this deck is very nurturing and supportive, and it just seems to really kind of give me that little bit of gentle hug almost that I need during that time. It does bring me insights. It tells me what I need to know, but it does it in such a soft and gentle way that I don't feel any more overwhelmed than I already am during the full moon time. So this is just one of those decks that, it could be like a hug deck. I feel like half of these decks that I've shown could be in like a hug deck category. Apparently, I needed a bunch of hug deck energy in 2021, which really isn't surprising because it's been a really rough year. But anyway, this one works beautifully for kind of just helping me to navigate that energy, which is already quite challenging for me. These are the backs. I believe this is the Awakening edition. Like I said, it was gilded. I couldn't stand the gilding, so I chopped it off and I edged it myself. But yep, this is just a really gentle hug deck, and it ended up just being the one that I used just a little bit more than the Starchild or the Moonchild Tarot, which again are my other kind of primary full moon reading decks. But yeah, I love this one. It just kind of gives me that gentle nudge. That little gentle, everything's gonna be okay, but here's what you need to know. Like, you can't just ignore everything, even though you wanna like pull your head under the covers. So that is the Ember and Aura Tarot, the deck I use most for my full moon readings. So there you go. These are the decks that I used the most in 2021. We have the Gentle Tarot, the Future Ancestor Tarot, the Animals Divine. Let's see if I can fit them all in here. The little Centennial Tin, the Dreaming Way Tarot, the Morgan Greer, and again, these were kind of like my primary main reading decks that I used for just general readings throughout most of the year. Then we also have the Lioness Oracle Tarot. I'll have to start stacking them. The Black Lily Tarot, put that one right there. Make a little room. The Seasons of the Witch Samhain Oracle, and the Ember and Aura Tarot, which we're gonna put right there. So there you have it. Those are my top 10 reading decks for 2021. It was so much fun to do this VR to Nina at Shuffle Tarot. I will definitely leave her video linked in the description box below for you so you can go check that out. I would love to know what your top 10 reading decks are, so feel free to let me know if you've done a VR or leave it in the comments below so I can check it out. Thank you so much for joining me today, and I'll see you again soon in another video.